So my name is Bart Nijssen, and as the Chair of Civil and Environmental Engineering, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Edward Wenk Jr. Endowed Lectureship in Technology and Public Policy. Special thanks to Mrs. Wagner and members of the Wenk family for making this lecture possible. Professor Wenk started his career during World War II working as an engineer on submarine design with the US Navy. A decade after the war, he became the chair of the Engineering Mechanics Department of the Southwest Research Institute in Texas, and then moved back to Washington, D.C. a few years later to become the first science advisor to Congress. He then served as an advisor to Congress and the White House under 3 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. In 1970, he came to the University of Washington, where he held joint appointments in civil engineering and in what is now known as the Evans School. And he founded a new graduate program in social management and technology. Social management of technology. The program had the express goal to make engineers more aware of the social impacts of their engineering projects. The program no longer exists, but I cannot help but think that the program would be of great interest if it existed today. In preparing for this introduction, I came across an interview with Dr. Wenk in 1983. In this interview, he stated the following, which I shortened a little bit, but the management of what might be alluded to as large technology should not be left only in the hands of the industrial managers or technologists. That means people will have to change both their attitudes and their aptitudes. Put another way, being a citizen in a democracy in the 21st century is going to be tougher, more demanding than it has been previously. People are going to have to do their homework. They're going to have to be committed to political action. I don't mean radical action, but the use of all communication channels in our very complex political system to make their voices heard. And these should be the voices, to every extent possible, of informed people. Today, technology has become more political than ever before, though it hasn't been widely recognized. Because of the ubiquitous use and influence of technology, the question of who wins and who loses becomes more important. He also noted that there are some very significant and powerful currents in our society today that predispose people to be concerned about what is going to happen tomorrow morning rather than looking ahead. This interview was published almost 40 years ago, long before the internet and before concerns about climate change were in the public eye. Professor Wenk was particularly concerned about nuclear exchange, or nuclear war, right? A threat that is of course still with us, but his insights are relevant to much of what we do as engineers. As someone who did his graduate degree in the same department, all I can say is that I wish to have had an opportunity to take some of Professor Wenk's classes, but he retired before I started. All right, with that background, I would like to pivot to today's speaker, who herself studies the intersection between engineering and its social, economic, and environmental implications. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Paulina Jaramillo, who is a professor in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also the co-director of the Green Design Institute at CMU, a fellow of the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation and Research at CMU, and a research affiliate of the Kigali Collaborative Research Center. She also holds a courtesy appointment in CMU Africa, which is in Kigali. But recently, Professor Jaramillo was a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report as part of Working Group 3, which is the working group that focuses on climate change mitigation, assessing methods for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. I've known Paulina for much of the past decade, during which we were co-PIs on an NSF-funded project to look at the intersection between water and energy under climate change. During that time, she not only taught me a lot about energy systems, but also how to work effectively on large multidisciplinary projects. Her talk today will focus on a different project in which she and her collaborators developed an open energy outlook for the United States. And with that, please hold your questions till the end of the lecture. After the Q&A, we will have a reception in the space immediately outside of this room. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Jaramillo.
Thanks, Bart, for that introduction. It's amazing it's been almost a decade since we started talking, and I'm a somewhat I'm an engineer by training, but I've never really done civil engineering, and working with Bart's group was such a thrilling experience of interdisciplinary collaboration. I also have a soft spot for Seattle. When I graduated from high school, it's going to be 25 years ago, my first trip to the United States, or my entrance to the United States, was through a language school at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, where I lived for 9 months, thinking I was going to return to Colombia, and then I never moved back to Colombia. I stayed in the US, so I have a soft spot for Olympia and the Seattle area. So before I talk about the research, I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction about me. And so I have 3 degrees in civil and environmental engineering. I did my undergraduate degree at Florida International University in Miami, and I was very active in the student chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And that's probably the most civil engineering I've done ever in my career. Even though after finishing my undergraduate, I went to Carnegie Mellon to do a master's in civil and environmental engineering. And then I stayed and did a PhD in civil and environmental engineering. I defended my thesis when I was 7 months pregnant. And so fortunately, my advisor had funding, and I was able to stay for a postdoc, also in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at CMU. I actually interviewed here for a faculty position in 2010. It didn't work out, but I moved that year I moved to a faculty position in my home department now, which is the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. So I do have 3 degrees in civil and environmental engineering, and I work on issues around climate and energy transitions, which is not what I was taught as an undergraduate engineer in environmental engineering. So this is just to show that what you do for your undergraduate and even what you do for your PhD does not determine what we do for the rest of our lives. And in fact, we often have opportunities to just reinvent ourselves through our careers. And that has been true even since I became a professor. So in 2010 to 2014, I managed a project looking at the integration of renewable energy resources in the grid. When I was an undergrad, I took an introduction class to electrical engineering, and I hated it. And then I ended up doing some power system stuff at that point. And that's around that time I met Daniel. I moved into an assistant professor position and started working on power system decarbonization. So again, learning more and more about the power system. And since 2016, I started doing work in energy in the context of the Global South, particularly in Africa. I spent 2016 and the academic year between 2016 and 2017 at CMU Africa. So Carnegie Mellon has a campus in Kigali in Rwanda where we offer master's degrees to African students in information technology, electrical and computer engineering, and now artificial intelligence. So I spent a year working in the campus there and doing research on global South and energy issues. And since 2019, so I kept staying at CMU one way or another, and now they're stuck with me because I got tenure. I'm a full professor. And now I continue working on energy transitions, climate change mitigation, and some climate change impact assessment. Like Bart said, I was a coordinating lead author for one of the chapters of the report by Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That report was released earlier this year. And so I also want to tell you, so this is my professional career. It has been based in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. And when I tell people I work in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, no one knows what that means. So it's a very unique department, and I guess Dr. Wenk in 1970 had an idea of creating something like that here at the University of Washington, We are a department within the College of Engineering, so we're our own department within the College of Engineering at Carnegie Mellon, and we do research at the intersection of of engineering systems and society. So we have different areas of research. I'm in the energy and environment, but we have people that work on cybersecurity, privacy, misinformation, and most of us come from an engineering or technical background, although we also have professors in economics and psychology, social decision sciences, and so it's a very interdisciplinary program. We have a double undergraduate minor, so traditional engineering, like in the students in the traditional engineering programs can do a minor with us. We have a master's program and PhD program. And admissions, I don't know how many, if there are many undergrads, but applications for the PhD program are due in December. We're also hiring 2 to 3 faculty, junior faculty. So if there are any PhD students in the job market, maybe you could look into us. And so with that, I want to talk to you about what the focus of my talk was. And so it's, the title is the Open Energy Outlook, an open and collaborative modeling effort for U.S. decarbonization. This is a collaborative effort, so I'm presenting, but the work was done with Jeremiah Johnson, who's a professor at North Carolina State University, Katie Jordan, who's one of my PhD students, Adi Sinha, who's a postdoc at NC State, Aranya Venkatash, who's a research scientist, and Joe DiCarolis. I'll talk to him about him later, but he's now on leave since March 2022. And so to give you a little bit of context, I would argue that climate change is the greatest challenge we face in the 21st century. This is a figure that comes from the Working Group 3 report for the Physics Assessment report showing what has happened to temperature change since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And in the, let's see if this works. Yeah, so this is based on climate models, of which Bart can speak better. But this is the simulations with observed changes in concentration of CO2 and greenhouse gases, and this is what has been happening to temperatures. And if you remove the increased concentrations of CO2 into the atmosphere and run the models, this is what the temperature trajectory, the green one will be what the temperature trajectory looks like. And so there is consensus that human activity and the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is driving these increases in temperature. In the sixth assessment report, the main statement is that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that we are already seeing widespread and rapid changes in atmosphere, oceans, cryosphere, and biosphere. This is very different. The first assessment report came out in 1990, and at that point they said, we know that humans are emitting CO2 and that we understand the physics of the greenhouse gas effect, but the evidence for climate change is not, won't be evident for decades to come. Decades later, it is now evident. So the international community agreed in 2015 through the Paris Agreement to address climate change, and the goal is to limit the stated goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Does anyone know how much have temperatures increased already? Yeah? 1.1. So we're already at 1.1, and the goal is to try to limit it to 1.5. And so the IPCC report also found that the current commitments for mitigating emissions are not sufficient to limit climate change to 2 degrees Celsius. And so this figure shows in the red the trend in greenhouse gas emissions that we've committed to, and the green is what greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2, need to look like in order to meet the 1.5 degree target. So this is the gap in our commitments. So it's a big gap from where we are. The US is the second largest emitter in the world. Who's currently the first? China. Cumulative emissions from the US are higher, so there's the cumulative versus annual, but clearly the US has to make stronger commitments to net zero. And so because the energy system is one of the largest sources of CO2 emissions in the country, understanding decarbonization pathways must be a priority. And my research group, and some people here also use these models, argue that this type of models provide a systematic ways to examine future decarbonization pathways, evaluate technologies and choices, test the effect of different policies, and explore uncertainty. So these models are not forecasts. We're not using the models to predict the future. They're useful to evaluate in a systematic way all of these issues. Because energy systems, this is a quote from a book in 1993 that says that energy system modeling is a form of post-normal science where facts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. This is absolutely true of models or like the decisions we're making related to climate change, right? There's uncertainty about the future will look like. There's definitely values in disputes, what's important to different people, but the stakes are high and we need to act urgently. And so under this environment, the modeling process matters. It isn't just, and I'm teaching a decision-making methods class to my undergraduates right now. And one of the big challenges for the students taking that class is that they're used to putting numbers in an equation, getting numbers out, and that's it. But in my class, I keep telling them it isn't just about the numbers you get. It is the process of thinking through the through the problem. And so the modeling, the process really matters, and understanding that. And so we argue that we need a rigorous treatment of uncertainty, that open source models and tools are now should be the standard practice for energy system models using publicly available data, so that we can have transparent and reproducible analyses. So the Open Energy Outlook Initiative, which is the initiative I'm co-leading with my colleagues at North Carolina State University, aims to examine U.S. energy futures to inform energy and climate policy efforts by applying the gold standard and policy-focused academic modeling that maximizes transparency and builds a network community. We're funded by the Sloan Foundation. There's a more core team of people working on the project at Carnegie Mellon and North Carolina State. But we also have over 40 technical advisors with expertise in different areas of the energy system, and they can provide guidance and advice on modeling tools, data issues, and even the research questions we should be analyzing. So for this purpose, we use model-based analysis of the energy system. We rely on a model called TEMOA, and I'll talk about this, but our modeling system looks at the entire energy system. And so we are looking at from end-use demands, so how much energy, how much lighting do we need, how many passenger miles we travel, how many ton-kilometers do we have to move goods. And so that's what we have, that's what serves as an input to the model. And then the model optimizes the deployment of end-use technologies, energy carriers and conversion technologies, and primary sources. So we have a representation of the entire energy system from supply to demand. It is based on the TEMOA model, which is a full optimization model that represents the system. The model optimizes is a least cost optimization model. So the objective function is to minimize the net present value of the costs of operating the system. And it optimizes fuel shares, supply, and end-use technologies. We operate at The model runs in 5-year increments between 2020 and 2050. For the power sector representation, which I think there's some power system people in the audience, we have a specific way of characterizing some of the very high resolution parameters that are important when operating the power system. And so we use, it's called representative 8-day modeling. The model account is, all of the data and everything is broken out into 9 regions in the US. But we characterize over 3,000 distinct demands with 80,000 processes. And the data for all of these demands and processes come from publicly available data from EIA, the EPA, published reports. And so all of this data is, it's well documented. The model, the code and the model documentation and the data are available for anyone who wants to use them. And I'll provide some links at the end. One of the things I said earlier is that understanding uncertainty is very important in these type of models. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework we use called modeling to generate alternatives to explore alternate feasible solutions that can account for such uncertainty. So we just published our first Open Energy Outlook report, and in that report we looked at 4 unique decarbonization scenarios with pathways for reducing emissions between 20% and 100% by 2050. And so we call the scenarios, the first scenario is the no new policy. When we were running these, this is before Congress got its act together and passed the first climate legislation ever in the country. So the no new policy scenario accounts for policies that were in place at the end of 2021. And so by the end of 2021, states have renewable portfolio standards, EPA had regulation on criteria pollutants, the California cap and trade system was already in place. So this scenario, which is a reference scenario, we call it the no policy scenario, accounts for all of that. We also, and that leads to a 20% reduction in emissions by 2050. We also have a state level action scenario and a COP26 scenario. So the state level action aimed to characterize what would happen if states decided to pursue climate regulation on their own and how far could that reach us. The COP26 scenario is looking at the commitments the US has done to the process of the Paris Agreement. And our final scenario is a policy neutral net zero scenario where regardless, we are not modeling specific policy instruments, we're modeling what happens to the system if we force it to reduce emissions to reach net zero by 2050. And so those are the 4 scenarios. The no policy, think of that as our reference scenario, and the net zero scenario is the one that would take us to the level of what the target, the 1.5 degree target requires. And so in policies that constrain, not surprisingly, policies that constrain carbon emissions result in continued growth of renewables. Interestingly, that growth happens even in the no new policy scenario. Again, in the no new policy, there were already things that were embedded in the system. There was already, California already have a cap and trade program, and there's renewable portfolio standards. So you see the renewables are increasing their share, but most of the growth happens in natural gas, and then coal remains in the system. So we still see in that reference scenario, there's still coal generation until 2050. In the other intermediate scenarios, you start seeing coal being phased down, and in the net zero scenario, coal completely disappears from the energy mix by the 2040s. In the intermediate scenarios, natural gas still remains significant. And natural gas and oil still exist even in the net zero scenario. But in these scenarios, we start seeing way more renewables than in the reference scenario. Something that is important, like the relevant the difference in like the shares that are now from renewables even in the COP26 and state action, renewables by 2050 are much more prevalent. One of the things that is really important, and so this is in units of primary energy consumption in exajoules, but something that's really important to highlight is that decarbonization really relies on electrification of a lot of end uses. So transitioning from conventional resources to electricity. So even in scenarios, in the reference scenario, we see a massive expansion of wind and solar capacity. So this is power plant capacity, generating capacity. It increases even in the reference, and then increases even more under COP26 and the state scenario, and in the net zero scenario, wind and solar capacity in 2050 is more than a factor of 3 compared to the no policy scenario. But even, it isn't just wind. If you look at just the total amount of energy, of power generation capacity between today and 2050, even in the more relevant, like the intermediate carbon emission constraint scenarios, you're seeing a doubling of generating capacity in the power system, and in the net zero, it's a tripling of power generation capacity. That's a massive expansion in the power system. That's a lot of power plants to build in the next 30 years. So what's driving this additional demand for electricity is primarily from electrification of transport and even some use of hydrogen. And so even in the more, this is hydrogen demand by 2050, and this is electricity demand. And so even in the moderate, like COP26 or state level scenarios, you're seeing a lot of increased demand in electricity, particularly in the transportation sector. And I'll talk a little bit more detail into those results when I go into the details of the net zero scenario. But the other important thing in this comparison is what happened to costs. And so, like I said, this is it's a cost minimization model. So it's minimizing the cost of operating the entire energy system from 2020 to 2050. And it accounts for operating costs, investment costs, and this is the total discounted present value, so the present value of operating the energy system in all of these scenarios. And something that might be surprising is to see that the difference is not like that. The magnitude of the difference is not even very obvious in this figure. Now, we're talking about trillions of dollars, so like the difference between the scenarios is actually, I think, like $1 trillion, which sounds like a lot, but something that we failed in these discussions about transitions, something we failed to capture is that we need to invest in the energy system continuously. It's not like we are replacing the energy system and building a brand new one if we want to do decarbonization. We have to continue operating and building the energy system regardless, and that in itself is already expensive. And to show that, I'm going to show you this figure, and let's focus first on the one on the left. This is the annual cash flows discounted. And so, because this is a least cost optimization over 30 years, we have to account for the time value of money, so we use a social discount rate. I think it's about 5% in the model. And so here, these are the cash flows in today's, like discounting to the present value. And most of the costs that you see are related to the transportation sector. Why would we be spending so much in transportation? And this is in all scenarios, right? In the no policy and the net zero. There's a lot of cash flows going into transportation. What will happen to our cars in the next 30 years? Will you have the same car 30 years from now that you have today? Probably not. I mean, some of our cars we have here today may end up in Africa, unfortunately, June. But they will not be here, and we will have to replace our trucks and our buses, and like just through turnover, right? Like we buy new cars, we buy new buses, and so that will continue happening even if we don't do anything about decarbonizing the energy system. And that is the largest share of the costs. We have to build new power plants, even if we don't expand the need for, like even if we don't go through net zero, we still have to replace power plants that reach the end of life. And we need to build transmission capacity. So all those costs, like the comparison isn't, if we do decarbonization, we have to pay for a lot, whereas if we don't do anything, we don't pay anything. We still will be paying a lot to maintain the energy system that we are accustomed to. Now, what the other side shows is the impact of discounting. So this is the cash flows if they were not discounted. If we said there is no time value of money, we value money today the same as we would value money 30 years from now. And so they're more evenly, that's where, and actually in that, you see some of the cash flows of the net zero scenario are higher at the end of the period because of later investments that are needed. But because we value money differently, those large, later investments are discounted into today's. So that was just to highlight the importance of the time value of money in looking at these analyses. And the discount rates can vary significantly. If we were doing this analysis for East Africa, which I have a student looking at, we would not be using a 5% discount rate. The time value of money in developing countries is much higher because the cost of capital is much higher. So that was a summary of all of the scenarios. I now want to go more in depth into the net zero scenario, because the net zero scenario is the one that is consistent with the targets of the Paris Agreement. So net zero scenario means we would meet net zero emissions by 2050 from the energy system. And what that looks like is like this. And so the dark black line is the net emissions in any given year. We have forced the system to reach net zero by 2050 in a linear fashion. But as you saw, there are still natural gas, even in the net zero, there's still some natural gas being used and some oil being used. The reason we see that is because there are some very hard to decarbonize activities, and the model accounts for the possibility of what is called carbon dioxide removal. And so carbon dioxide removal are technologies that allow us to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the model will not solve, with the technologies we have parameterized in the model, if we don't have carbon dioxide removal, the model won't solve. So there are two ways of seeing this. One is if you think the carbon dioxide removal is a pipe dream and it's not going to happen, I'm sorry to say that means we probably will not meet the 1.5 degree target. And this is consistent with what the IPCC, the report from Working Group 3 noted. The report from Working Group 3, the quote from the chair of Working Group 3 when the report was released was that it is most likely unavoidable that we will need carbon dioxide removal to meet the 1.5 degree target. And so the way I take it is these technologies are not commercially and widely deployed today. We're going to need them by 2050. We need to start investing in the research and development of these technologies now so that they're available at that point. Like I said before, this net zero future really relies on a lot of electricity. And so we had to simulate how is the electricity system operating. Here we have an hourly dispatch of the 8 representative days each year, and the days were selected based on times where the power system would be constrained. So net load, peak, peak load, peak ramp rates. And so the first is, this is what the power system looks like in 2020. where you have some coal still. There's more and more renewables, but by 2030, we then see a lot more renewables, which requires the deployment of batteries, which is the red. We actually see some increases in nuclear, and because of the variability and intermittency of wind, we actually have to oversize capacity of wind and solar, and some of it is what we call curtailed. And so this is how the power system is operating, and you can see very clearly the daily patterns of solar during the day and then disappearing at night, and then you can see charging and discharging of the batteries. With so much electricity needed, it also means we're going to need a lot of interregional transmission capacity. The model does not, we don't have any, the only spatial disaggregation we have is the 9 regions, so we don't know what capacity transmission may be needed within each region. We have, what we can see is how much capacity will be needed across region. Now, the US system is actually pretty interconnected with Canada, and so those were modeled as for like the electricity from Canada, this amount of electricity will be available from Canada. That has to be resolved in later years where we can do more modeling of the integrated Canada and US system. Like I said, so the transportation sector currently accounts for 1/3 of emissions in the US. So in the net zero scenario, there's a lot of efficiency gains in early years and widespread electrification in the latter years. So this is what happens to energy use in the land-based transportation. And so can anyone tell me why is demand actually decreasing? Students? Electric vehicles are way more efficient. So we're seeing significant, but even in these, like we see improvements in diesel and internal combustion engines. But electric vehicles are just way more efficient. So you see an efficiency improvement, even though demand for transportation services is actually growing. Now we still see, even in the land-based transportation, we still see residual oil and diesel, and I'll show you why, but it's mostly because of long-haul trucking. Now, the transportation sector also includes shipping and aviation. Those are considered hard to decarbonize sectors, and so in those sectors, jet fuel and residual fuel oil remain as the prevalent sources of energy up to 2050, even in the net zero scenario. And this is why we would need carbon dioxide removal, because these are hard to decarbonize sectors for which there are now, like the technologies are not as prevalent or are more expensive than even carbon dioxide removal. You might be interested a little bit more detail on what happened to light duty vehicles. And so this is what happens to our light duty vehicle. We see definitely a decrease away in light duty vehicles, a decrease away from gasoline. But in the intermediate years, up to the 2040s, there's still a lot of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles being deployed. And so plug-in hybrids they have like a gasoline engine and an electrical engine, and so you can drive short distances on electricity, but if you're driving longer distances, the gasoline engine might be available. And the reason we're seeing so much plug-in hybrid electric vehicles early on is because some weird characterization of if demand for fossil fuels decreases, the price also decreases. So there's a price elasticity of supply that we try to capture. And so like the net zero scenario actually has lower energy prices than our reference scenario, oil prices than the reference scenario. And this is something we're working on better improving. But by 2050, all new vehicles are electric vehicles. The other interesting thing here is we do not see hydrogen being used in the light duty vehicle fleet. I went to COP earlier this month, and I gave a talk at the Japan Pavilion, and I can tell you that some Japanese automakers are not happy with this type of result. There is really a push for hydrogen by certain automakers for light-duty vehicles. Transportation guys, why would we use hydrogen for light-duty vehicles? Like, why wouldn't we use hydrogen for light-duty vehicles? Why just use electricity? It's even simpler than that, right? The only way we can do low carbon hydrogen is through electricity. And so if you're going to convert electricity to hydrogen back to electricity, why not just do electricity to batteries directly, right? Any transformation process you add adds inefficiency to the system. But in trucking, we do see hydrogen being deployed. And so for especially on long haul, you start seeing a lot of hydrogen deployments later on. Long distance, like the batteries for heavy duty trucks that have to drive long distances are not, like you need energy density in those vehicles, and hydrogen is much more energy dense than batteries. The interesting thing is, and I was talking to someone earlier, energy system models have historically had a very poor representation of industrial decarbonization options. The industrial sector is a major source or a major user of energy. And so for this effort, we were able to improve the parameterization of some electricity and hydrogen technologies in industry so that we do see electrification of boilers and space heating in the industrial sector. However, natural gas persists in processes that require a lot of high temperature heat. There are some processes that we don't have very well represented in the model, so that's our focus for the next year of research on this, is how to represent, better represent low carbon options for ammonia, ethylene, and methanol production, which are some of the major uses of energy in the industrial sector. Interestingly, we actually were able to parameterize some electrification of cement and iron and steel. And so there's actually some hydrogen steel making and electric kilns that are now starting to appear for these processes, and we see them deployed in the model. For cement, one of the challenges is that the emissions from cement are not so much from energy, but from the chemical reaction that happens when we're making cement. And so we need to better characterize, we have to do a better characterization of how to address those emissions. And then I'm just going to quickly go through, in buildings, we see a lot of electrification with particularly the use of heat pumps. I think heat pumps are probably very prevalent here in the Pacific Northwest, right? Because they can heat and cool. And it turns out the technology for cold weather heat pumps has really increased in the last 10 years. So heat pumps are one of the most efficient ways of reducing emissions from buildings. And so the other thing that's really important is we see a lot of hydrogen used in the net zero, and we see a lot of carbon dioxide removal. Now, what's interesting is in this parametric, like in deterministic simulation, we see that most of the hydrogen is actually being produced through a technology called biomass energy with carbon capture and sequestration. And so most of it is coming from biomass, very little from electricity. It's like what is showing when we run the scenario like this is like electrolytic hydrogen is just too expensive. But then here, again, what you see is a lot of sequestration, geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide removal is needed to meet that net zero target, which can we get that? Can we actually do, it is a question, can we do that much geological sequestration? And if we want to do that much geological sequestration, we need to start investing in that technology, making sure that technology and the infrastructure is available. And so to finish, I want to tell you, we did an uncertainty analysis. And so what we did was something called modeling to generate alternatives, where we basically give slack to the objective function and then run many more simulations that reach the net zero target at near optimal solutions. And the way I'm going to present that is through a correlation matrix. And so this figure has all of the technologies, so all of the primary fuel technologies and fuel uses in both the X and Y axis. And so when technologies, in scenarios, we have 200 simulations with unique solutions that reach a net zero target at near optimal cost. And so across those 200 solutions, when two technologies are consistently, like the deployment of one technology is consistently associated with a high deployment of another technology, that means they're positively correlated, and that's shown in the blue squares. Some technologies, when one technology is deployed in the simulations, another one is not deployed as much, and so they're negatively correlated, and that's in the red. I have to point out that the correlation just shows relationships in deployment. It doesn't tell us much about the magnitude of deployment of these technologies. So some technologies that might be positively correlated, one of them can still be deployed at very low levels. It's just that it's positively correlated. And so this is a big figure. I'm going to go through some of the interesting results. To start, predictably, solar and wind are positively correlated. So wind and solar, yeah. So wind and solar are positively correlated. Now, solar and batteries are very positively correlated, whereas wind and batteries are less positively correlated. And then nuclear is somewhat positively correlated with wind. So what's happening is, if you have solar and wind, they're positively correlated. They're deployed together. When you have a lot of solar, you definitely have a lot of batteries. Batteries are not as necessary if you have wind, but nuclear can support some of the integration of wind resources. So that's what those that's what those correlations are telling us. Now, electric vehicles, we can see that wind and nuclear are positively correlated with electric vehicles. And that is because in the model right now, we're assuming charging happens at home and at night. And so there's no sun at night. So most of the charging for the electric vehicles is happening with nuclear and solar. Now, that the correlation between electric vehicles and solar is lower doesn't mean that we don't deploy solar. All of these scenarios have large-scale deployment of solar and batteries across the 200 simulations. Okay, and then hydrogen is also some interesting resource. First of all, this is the correlation of hydrogen with wind and solar, and the strength of the correlation is low. So it suggests that we're not seeing a lot of electrolytic hydrogen being used. What we see is, the other thing is, in the last slide before, I told you that most of the hydrogen was produced with bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. In the first simulation, the most cost optimal. But when we give it slack, those two, biomass and hydrogen, are actually barely correlated. And so in the deterministic one single solution, we see a lot of biomass, but across the 200 simulations that reach net zero with near optimal, biomass is not the largest source of that hydrogen. The largest source of hydrogen is natural gas. And the reason we can do it and reach net zero is because there's a positive correlation between hydrogen and CCS. So carbon capture and sequestration, so capturing CO2 during the process of producing hydrogen from natural gas, as well as carbon dioxide removal. And so again, this highlights, given what we know about the hydrogen technologies, and there's a lot of work on electrolytic hydrogen, so that could change, right? If we really don't like these results, means we need to really invest also on electrolytic hydrogen production so that they become more prevalent instead of having to rely on this technology. And then the last one I want to show you is the transportation fuels, because this one gave us a headache. These results gave us a headache. And so why did they give us a headache? So if you look at petroleum and EVs, they are positively correlated pretty strongly. It's a pretty dark blue. And then if you look at hydrogen and EVs, they're negatively correlated. Okay, so that makes sense. If you're deploying EVs, you're not deploying hydrogen in the transportation sector, but you're deploying petroleum. So that was that just didn't really make a lot of sense until it took a lot of thinking to figure it out. That's why you can't just take the results out of the model. So what's happening is EVs compete with hydrogen and direct air capture pathways. So if you see hydrogen and direct air capture. So this is direct air capture. Hydrogen and direct air capture are positively correlated. So is natural gas. And so the other one you have here is this is Fischer-Tropsch fuels. Fischer-Tropsch fuels are synthetic hydrocarbons. So they're just like gasoline-based, like fossil-based fuels, but they're produced synthetically in the model, they're using the carbon dioxide captured from facilities or from the air with hydrogen. And what you produce is like jet fuel, for example. You can produce jet fuel that any airplane we have right now can be used from captured CO2 and from hydrogen. And so when the model is deploying hydrogen and direct air capture, it can use that hydrogen to produce Fischer-Tropsch liquids that are used in long-distance trucks or in ships and in airplanes. If you deploy EVs, you're not deploying hydrogen, so you have to rely on diesel for those hard to decarbonize segments of the transportation. So that's why we see a positive correlation between EVs and petroleum fuels. When you're deploying EVs, you have to use petroleum-based fuels for shipping, aviation, and long distance. But if you have a hydrogen pathway, then you can use that for light-duty vehicles, but you also have it available for the synthetic hydrocarbons. So it took us a while to figure that out. Now, that is not to say that if we have EVs, we have very high levels of petroleum. Petroleum decreases in all of the net zero scenarios, because the correlation, again, doesn't tell us anything about the magnitude, it's just the relationship between technologies. So the final thing, my final conclusion, is that deep decarbonization in the US requires immediate action, but not necessarily massive investments, increase in spending compared to what we're going to have to spend anyway. Now, the other thing that I think is very important is that there are a multitude of technology pathways that exist that can lead us to net zero. It isn't just one pathway. It's not like if we don't pursue this specific technology, we're not going to make it. There are a breadth of technologies that can get us there. And it's probably good to both invest in electrolytic hydrogen and carbon dioxide removal, because we probably need both. And because we don't, if one of them doesn't work, then maybe the other one is we would need it even more. Fortunately, the Inflation Reduction Act took that approach, and they provided support for pretty much all of the technologies that appear in our 200 simulations. CCS, hydrogen, carbon dioxide removal, renewables, electric vehicles. So the policy actually does at least allow us to hedge our bets, I guess, a little bit. And then again, the marginal cost of reaching net zero is relatively low. It's like $1 trillion is a lot. It's about that. But it's relatively low compared to the cost of maintaining a reliable energy system and the climate damages associated with an overshoot. And so that's one of the other big things we wanted to highlight. And with that, I want to point out that we believe open collaboration is critical. The model is accessible. The funding was provided by the Sloan Foundation, and it's a collaboration between Carnegie Mellon and NC State with an advisory board from institutions all over the world. I want to thank especially Joe DeCarolis. So Joe DeCarolis did his PhD at Carnegie Mellon, then he was a professor at North Carolina State University. He's the developer of the Temoa model, and we started working on this initiative together, and he is now on leave from NC State and is the administrator of the Energy Information Administration, so he's working for the federal government. So he inspired this work, but none of this work, he represents his views or the views of the Energy Information Administration. And then I'm just going to leave you, we have all kinds of links here where you can read the report, or you can access the model or the data repository, or you can even join our mailing list.